China has been Africa's largest trading partner for the last 10 consecutive years. In 2018, trade between the two was over $200 billion, a year-on-year jump of 20%. Chinese companies have become more actively involved in Africa through the Belt and Road Initiative. How does Europe view China's growing presence in Africa, and how can China-EU cooperation contribute to Africa's sustainable development? I sat down with Dominique de Villepin, the former French Prime Minister and a Chunqiu Senior Fellow at the China Institute, Fudan University. We began with his vision for Africa by 2050.
I do think that there is an African spirit. I was born in the African continent, and I recognize that there is something special about Africa. The way to look at one another, the way to look at the future. There is an optimism which is very specifically African. So I do believe that one of the objectives is to free the energy of Africa, which is full of creativity. You know, Africans, they are fantastic to imagine new things. They can do with an old car a new car. They can really rearrange things. And I believe they have this energy, capacity for innovation that may explain that they be able to pass on some stages of development we have gone through, for example, with the Europeans, and enter very directly to the high-tech century without going through all these different steps.
Do you really believe in that? Because
I believe
Africa,
in that.
there are
the
many...
cell phones are growing in Africa. High-tech is being part of every day of many young Africans. But at the same time,
yes,
some part of Africa is still in the Middle Ages. So we should try to think a global future with Africa, which is going to avoid too many differences at the same time in the continent, which might create misunderstandings, tensions, conflict. So in order to share better the development around the continent, we should put more capital, more energy in order to help them in this process. For example, electricity is not everywhere in every city. For example, there is a growing size of the cities, monster cities in Africa, with such big differences with rural areas. We should avoid these too many and big differences that can create a strong problem and strong challenges.
You talk about a new partnership between China and Africa, between China and Europe for Africa. How important is that, especially to help Europe achieve its goal in Africa, in that ambitious plan that was outlined?
Well, I think on the side of China, there has been also a new awareness with a very huge financial program, $60 billion that has been announced a couple of months ago by President Xi. This shows the importance of the mobilization of financial resources here in China towards Africa. But at the same time, China can see that the problems are huge. And China can see that without synergy, we might risk to enter in a competition between great powers towards Africa, competition with Europe, competition with the US, and we will miss the opportunity to show to the world that we can work together. You see, we have two paths in front of us. The first one is to really follow up with the current globalization, with a multilateral system. The other path is a partition of globalization.
A partition?
A partition with on one side China and part of the world, and on another side the US and another part of the world, with different technologies, different internet system, different areas of influence. I think we should keep Africa out of these tensions.
How?
Africa needs both Europe as well as China, and the US, of course, can come into the same game. How? To see that the level of need of Africa, which is more than 60 billion, just for the infrastructure, more than $60 billion a year. You can see the size no country can be at the level of such an investment. So we need to work together. And we need to make sure that this support towards Africa is going to be well shared in order to guarantee a certain stability for Africa. Nothing will be worse than to enter in a new age of warring states, conflict, crisis. We have known that in the 70s and the 80s. This might be a process that would not be under control. And we all know that there are strong challenges in terms of health strategy, in terms of education, in terms of social stability. So a mobilization is absolutely needed if we want to show that we can work peacefully with one another. So I think Africa could be one of the main showcase for Europe and China to illustrate this capacity.
What are specific suggestions that you can bring forward to European policymakers or European governments, for instance? At this moment, China is very much on board, and China has said, look, the Belt and Road Initiative is an open platform. Countries, especially countries in Europe, are more than welcome to join. It has been always the reluctance on the part of the European countries or European Union as a whole to join the platform that China has laid out. What are some of specific suggestions that you can really give?
I think that with the help of some of the Silk Road funds and with the help of the Juncker plan, which also is mobilizing a huge amount of money from the European country, we could combine these capacities into an African fund, which will have the purpose of selecting some of the best projects of Africa that could change the pattern of African development. If we take the infrastructures, for example, very often in terms of airports, we see that to go to one place to another place in Africa, we need to go through Dubai, through Paris, or through non-African capitals. We should change that. We very often find out that some of our projects are too big for the realities of Africa. Let's take the good practices, for example, in Curitiba, Brazil. They find out that it will be much more helpful to have a service of very adapted buses than to put forward an important railway program. So we should adjust to these realities. Security, let's look what Medellin in Colombia has done in having the double of police officers in the ground in order to ensure security. So let's look at the realities, let's look at the good practices and try to implement some of these programs in having the question of development out of the daily politics of Africa, out of the daily interest of each one of us, in order to serve a common purpose. I think the world today needs good news.
You talk about bad news, switching on the TV and always see bad news. And for China, it's a very similar picture. Every time we switch on the news, it's about a story that's criticizing China, that's questioning China, that's suspecting China's intention. And again, I'm talking about the Belt and Road Initiative, for instance, or China's involvement in Africa. It has come with a lot of criticism. Some of these criticisms come from European countries. They talk about China's lack of transparency, lack of environmental protection awareness, or lack of accountability or this and that. What can European countries do by helping these projects, these Chinese projects, be up to par with international standards while achieving your interest, your objectives in Africa at the same time?
Well, I think the best way to avoid criticism is to be more transparent and to work on the basis of more partnership. This is the best way.
China is open to partnership.
I know,
partnership.
but
That's
you should not forget that the same kind of criticism are made towards the European. There are plenty of criticism from Africa towards Europe. This is normal. But we should be pragmatic in dealing with such criticism. Let's take the example of the exposure of some African countries to our debt. This is a reality, and that's why we should find new tools in order to help the African countries in dealing with such financial issues. Sometimes the criticism is linked to the fact that China is supporting huge programs. because that's the capacity of China in terms of infrastructure, in terms of construction, in terms of engineering projects. But that's why let's look sometimes at some smaller scale projects. If you take one of the...
Do you think that these are where European countries can better participate in terms of the partnership?
I think that's the way Africa, China and Africa, listening more to Africa, we can be more effective. Let's take the question of the monster cities and the problem of housing in this new metropolis in Africa. Of course, it's very tempting to have big and huge programs like we have in Europe, like you are having here in China or around the world. But what do Africa need today? Very often they need smaller scale programs that they can deal with, which are much more adapted to the population and to the needs of the population, and that are not going to be a source of criticism like the huge programs that are built and going along with many problems.
Finally, in terms of China-EU relationship on itself, do you see there is hope or optimism that this relationship will continue to upgrade, to develop on a steady manner? Because there was this very famous paper that came out which, you know, caused a lot of attention in China, where Europe is also kind of labeling China as a competitor, as a systemic rival. How do you look at that? How do you look at the future of China-EU relationship?
Well, I believe the future of these relations are in our hands. And we have a common interest in having a huge capacity, strong capacity to be innovative. If we are innovative, then we are going to be able to answer to the questions of our people, both here in China and in Europe. When you see the challenge between the US and China, you understand that the reality is that the US don't want to have China as number one in the world. This is not the problem of Europe. The problem of Europe is to have a balanced world, to have a world with more stability, with multilateral institutions, and a strong capacity to deal with the problems of our world. So I believe that between China and Europe, we have a strong interest in creating such a relation that we might open the way. For example, on trade. If we are able to make some breakthrough, to find some new ways to solve some of the problems that we are facing in terms of transparency, in terms of intellectual property, in terms of access to the market, China will be in a position to go back to the US and say, okay, you see that we had an agreement, we have an agreement with Europe. It is possible. Why can't we find a way to have an agreement together? So I believe this capacity for innovative ideas, this capacity for innovative cooperation, and a huge strategy between China, Europe, and Africa is part of this process. We should put more imagination. We should use this relationship between Europe and China to anticipate the difficulties of our world and to put forward new processes, new mechanisms, new ideas.
That's all for this edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin. As always, follow me on Facebook and Twitter using the handle The Point with LX. Download the application called CGTN to watch the show on your mobile devices, or go to YouTube and look for CGTN The Point. Thanks for watching. You've got The Point.